All good. Okay, well,
Yeah,
thanks
we
for
can see.
joining. It's interesting to see that you're actually a teacher Macbeth and you need the knowledge behind it because I tutored for a really long time and I did GCSE with Macbeth as well. And it helped them a lot to understand like the context of witches and place that in Macbeth. So hopefully this will help you and a lot of others that have come in. So although the chat function isn't working, I would just like you to quickly have a little think and in the Q&A just write down what you think is a witch. So just a basic little description of what you would consider a witch. I'll just give you a little minute. I'm loving these answers. See, I thought whenever I tend to ask it, it's always a stereotypical answer that comes through. But I like that you're saying like somebody like a wise woman, someone that uses alternative medicines and things like that. So I've put my information down. So I've obviously got my little Instagram blog and I'm rebranding my blog. So you'll have to bear with me. There's not too much on it at the moment, but there will be soon. So yeah, if you want to give that a follow, then go and check that out. And also my email address if you have any sort of like additional questions that come up later on as you go through. Okay, so to be able to understand witchcraft in the 17th century, I think it goes without speaking that you have to have an understanding of 17th century England. And there has been a history of religious back and forth since Henry VIII and up to Queen Elizabeth I, who tried to create that sort of middle ground and established the Church of England in 1559. So those strong religious attitudes aren't just going to disappear. So you have to kind of think what is going to happen with them? What is going to happen to the people that have these really strong religious convictions and all of a sudden they have to kind of push that aside? Like, what is then going to happen? So we have to think about religion. We have the little ice age. So we have a lot of bad harvests, bad weather, which is going to be detrimental to people that are farmers that make their living from farming. We also have disease and lack of medical awareness that comes later with the Enlightenment, which has actually been tied into the decline of magic. And then we also have the Civil War that occurs in the 1640s. So if I skip my way through. So I'm sure everyone knows who this is. So King James I, so he became King of England in 1603. So the unification of Scotland and England created this space which fostered his obsession and really gave him an opportunity to kind of take advantage of his position and do something about witchcraft. So he was a Protestant king. He exhibited an increase in paranoia over witchcraft, which is specifically evident with the North Berwick witch trials of 1590. So his desire to prosecute witches was really exasperated by that. And of course, that was in Scotland. So we're not going to touch too much on that, but you have to just bear that in mind. So he surrounded himself with a lot of intellectual debates on the topic, such as witchcraft and sorcery. But the purpose for his visit was to go to Copenhagen to arrange his marriage with Anne of Denmark. So upon their union, her journey to Scotland was not straightforward. There was a huge storm at sea, which you can see that is on this picture that's on the right, which is actually taken from The Tempest. So Shakespeare's Tempest, which I'm sure everyone's aware of, it was based on that. So it's sort of this chaotic scene at sea. And James was thinking, okay, well, it must have been caused by witches. How else is that going to happen? So he was warned by Lord Dingwall, who announced it, that there'd been an incident, the Queen was in danger, and he started asking these questions about weather magic, which resulted in this investigation concerning the North Berwick witches in Scotland. So following those witch trials, James produced a 3-volume text in 1597, which was called Demonology. So the text explicitly outlined James's attitude towards witches, and it worked to instill a negative connotation of the witch. So it detailed methods of identification, of prosecution, and it worked alongside the Witchcraft Act to inform the wider public of a witch's familiar, a witch's mark, and ability to exercise maleficia. So the witch's mark was said to be a physical manifestation of a diabolical pact, so a link with the devil, a pact with the devil. And it could be found in the shape of a freckle, a birthmark, a mole, any sort of other skin-like abnormality that they would consider. So it not only worked to shape societal attitudes towards witchcraft, but it also created a shift in the judicial system, and it encouraged the use of child testimonies. So that is something that is super important when it comes to Lancashire and the Pendle witches. So naturally, it will skip us on to the Pendle witches. So as you can see here, I have included a little timeline to help you place it as I chat through. So the trials are probably one of the most well-known in England. If you ask somebody, what do you know about witchcraft in England? They will say, oh, the Pendle witches or the Lancashire witches. So it's a really good one to talk about, but it was because it was such a main thing to happen. So they do possess a uniqueness that became a catalyst for other witch trials in the period. So Janet Device was the youngest member of the Device family and was estimated to be about 9 years old when she was approached by Sir Roger Nowell and Sir Edward Bromley. So she was coerced into complying with the authorities, and she provided a lot of detailed statements that damned her family, really. So she mentioned lots of different things about what her family would do. So you have this tie with a lot of making of clay dolls, like devil packs, familiars, which were mentioned a lot, especially with the Pendle witches. So they didn't really have a chance when she started talking. So the events that took place on the 18th of March in 1612 sparked the beginning of witchcraft accusations in Pendle. So they wasn't just located to Pendle, so they stretched to Salisbury and York as well. But Elizabeth Demdike, whose granddaughter Alison Device, was accused of placing a curse on John Law, who was a peddler from Halifax. So she was out begging and she came across this man and she asked him for pins. She pleaded for pins and he refused. He said no. So then shortly after that happened, she's supposed to have cursed him and he fell down. So he remained paralyzed on his whole left side, which today would indicate symptoms of a stroke. So this bewildering event brought with it accusations of bewitchment. So Alison apologized profusely and admitted to the part that she played in cursing the peddler. She really thought that it was her fault. And John Law's son Abraham, he took the case for Sir Roger Nowell, and Alison was questioned at Reed Hall. She expressed this genuine belief in her powers. She really thought that she had cursed this man, that he had fallen down, and that it was all her fault. So then we come to the 20th of April. So a meeting took place at Malkin Tower and saw the whole of the Device family and their neighbours accused of witchcraft. So the reason for the gatherings falls to the hands of Janet Preston of Gisborne, a friend of Elizabeth Southern. So she was the matriarch of this family. She was a known healer to the community. And Preston had previously been accused and acquitted of witchcraft at the York Assizes and required, supposedly, assistance in orchestrating the murder of Thomas Lister. So the gathering on Good Friday provided the authorities with a great deal of evidence that was used to convict the Pendle witches. And of course, as we mentioned before, religion is a huge part. They were expected to attend church. There would have been people there to monitor who was attending, and of course, they wasn't there. So they were subject to ridicule. They were then questioned their absence from church. They were accused of performing maleficia by making clay dolls, stealing cattle, cursing people in the community, conspiring to murder men, you name it. It just kept getting piled on. So then after this, we've got so much evidence because we've got the incident with Alison, we've got testimony from Janet. they awaited trial in August. So the Lancaster Assizes met on the 18th and 19th of August in 1612, and they held the trial of Elizabeth, James and Alison Device, Anne Whittle, Anne Redfern, John, I have to mention that that's the second man that we've mentioned, and Jane Bulcock, Alice Nutter, Catherine Hewitt and Alice Gray. Elizabeth Demdike, who was the matriarch, was also there, but she died awaiting trial, so she never actually saw it through. So the Pendle witches were questioned by Magistrate Roger Knoll, and the trial was recorded by Thomas Pott. So he published The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster, and that is our sole source for the trial. So it's very, very difficult to find primary sources on what happened on the Pendle witches. So what we have is very biased. He was a court clerk that was writing everything up, and you can see the attitude that he has. He wanted to impress the king, and you can see that in his dedication. So he dedicated it to someone that brought him up, the household that he was in, and he actually played a big role in uncovering the gunpowder plot in 1605. So it's really, really interesting to see how that works. So he was definitely inspired by King James's paranoia about witches, and this publication meant that he was gaining recognition, he was gaining popularity, and people were going to be looking at it. It has a lot of links to demonology, so he makes links to sexuality and politics, gender. A lot of the time when he's talking about the familiars and the links is in a very, very sexual way, and the tone changes when you're looking at the evidence given for the women as opposed to James Device. It is still including familiars, but the tone is very, very different. So the accounts were extremely repetitive, detailing the use of familiars, practicing witchcraft. It has charms, which involve a lot of religious hymns and sermons, words that would just all be molded into one because that's what they're hearing, it's what they're practicing each week. So Potts's work helps us to gain an understanding of the trials. And when we think about the texts that inspired them, I think it's important that we take a step back and actually look at King James's demonology. So this text opened up the door for Pendle Witch's execution. So it acted as a manual on witchcraft, dismissing this division that previously existed between white and black magic. That was no longer a thing. All magic was maleficent. It was all dangerous. It was all intended to cause harm or injury. And it shifted pre-existing views on the Pendle witches known to the community as healers. So that is something that is important to think about, because prior to this, you would have white and black magic. So you would have people that were in the community that would help support with medicinal purposes, would help to heal any sort of disease, anything that they could help with. So you have, at one point, you would go to them and ask them for help. And then the next day you're being told, oh, it's really bad. Everything that they are doing is bad. It's black magic. So then what happens? What do you do? So the testimony of Janet Device was accepted in court as King James outlined how, in a matter of treason against the prince, barns or wives, or never so defamed persons, may of our law serve for sufficient witnesses and proofs. Such witnesses may be sufficient in matters of high treason against God. So here he is stating how witchcraft is considered high treason, and in such cases, children should be allowed to testify in court. So it really, really changes the game. And you have to think, if you were accused of witchcraft and a child came in and said, yep, they did it, they cursed my cattle, are you going to believe them? But that's what they're saying here. So they're saying that if a child comes in and testifies, just like Janet Device did, who could have a lot of ulterior motives, she may not understand what she's seeing. She may have fallen out with her family. It may be anything, but then it was believed, it was taken as fact. So it was definitely a turning point for 17th century witch trials. So it became a vital tool in the prosecution of witches. So then we have to think about what on earth happened next. So it goes back to our context. So after we have the Pendle witches in 1612, it's said that James kind of got a little bit bored. I'm not really sure how true that is, but it says that he got a little bit bored with witches, and that is evident with the 1633 to 34 Lancashire witch trials that happened again. So with those ones, it supposedly involved Janet Device that actually testified against her family. So it involved this boy who was out. He was supposed to go back home and he didn't. He was late. So he ran back home, and then his reasoning for that was witchcraft. So he accused these women of witchcraft, and there was a whole trial and they were found guilty. But we have this shift in the mentality where people are starting to question that. They're not really sure that they should be found guilty. They're not sure if they are witches. So this big investigation takes place in London and everybody is investigated. And it turns out that what the boy was saying was a lie. He had fabricated it because he didn't want to get in trouble. So then their guilty verdict was rescinded. They were then found not guilty. And it really shows how in such a short space of time, really, you have such a big shift. So you can see that happening. The shift is happening in the 30s. But then in the 40s, we have another big witch hunt with East Anglia. So in that time, we have to think what has happened. The Civil War has happened. So tension was building with King Charles I and Parliament regarding the situation in Scotland and a lot of other things, which escalated into a war. So it gave way to a lot of propaganda, and Puritan belief in the devil was completely widespread. So it's therefore no surprise that unsettled and anxious communities started to show witchcraft, started to show that vulnerability, maybe that belief, maybe people could take advantage of that belief. So that is when we have people like Matthew Hopkins. So that is who we can see on the picture to the right. So you can see that he's got his whole outfit on, named himself the Witchfinder General, which is ridiculous. I have a lot of opinions about Matthew Hopkins, and I'm sure you will too. But yeah, so that's a really good one to hold on to see. Oh, sorry. So let's move on to Matthew Hopkins. Let's have a little look at him a little bit more. So we've looked at the types of people that were accused. So it could have been anybody from, it's typically women, usually living on the outskirts of society. It was, in the case of the Pendle witches, you had a matriarch, which people didn't like. She had a family that was very, very close. So naturally, people would say, okay, well, if Elizabeth Demdike is a witch, then her family must be witches. So it's tied into things like that. You have a lot of people, if there's an altercation, say about cattle, or maybe you've fallen out about something, and then the next day somebody is poorly in your family, then you'll say, well, you've cursed them, that must be your fault. But then you can actually flip it back. So if someone is accusing a witch, then you can say, well, you're a witch too. And it kind of just spirals out of control. So now we've looked at that, we're going to have a little look at Matthew Hopkins. So he named himself the Witchfinder General, and he was very influenced by King James's manual. So it gave rise to a financially driven Matthew Hopkins. So his Puritan upbringing aided his distaste for witches, and after receiving financial backing from the church, he proceeded to hunt witches with his co-worker John Stern. So Malcolm Gaskell actually describes how Hopkins and Stern styled themselves instruments of justice, and I think that's really appropriate. I think that really sums them up. So he was the main driving force behind the East Anglia witch hunts that took place between 1645 and 47. So it's estimated that he was responsible for over 90% of witchcraft executions in England. So we have 184 women who were tried in 2 years, and at least 100 of those were executed. So it's difficult in England because in England, the majority of the accused and executed were women, but that isn't the same across Europe. It differs. So for example, in Iceland, there's a very high majority that were men that were executed. So just by saying that there was a lot of women that were executed for witchcraft in England doesn't necessarily mean that witchcraft was an attack on women, but yeah, just bear that one in mind. So he used a varied methods that were questionable, very, very questionable. So he used psychological torture, such as sleep deprivation, to gain a confession. So although torture was illegal in England, such as the swimming test. So if you know about that, it was that if you duck a witch and she can hold breath, then she's a witch. If she doesn't, then she isn't a witch. But of course, you're then going to drown. So that was something that was definitely not allowed. Torture was not allowed in England, but he managed to get around that with sleep deprivation. So what he would do is walk people round and round and round, so they got so tired so that they would say anything, so that he hoped that they would be tired enough to just confess. So that was something that he did quite a lot, which in my opinion, I feel like should have been illegal. I don't feel like he should have been able to do that at all, but apparently it wasn't. So he would do that. He would also look for the witch's mark or the devil's mark. So the accused would be stripped of their clothing and their exposed body would be examined. So again, they would look for any sort of abnormality, I guess. But if you think about it, it could have been anything. It could be like a freckle, birthmark, mole. So the chances are, if they're stripping somebody down, that they're going to find something like that. So naturally, he went on to develop his own work, and he published The Discovery of Witches in 1647. So this was an attempt to answer public queries about witch hunting and to seem above board in what he was doing in his activities. So the idea that such a publication was needed demonstrates such a big shift in societal attitudes towards witchcraft and punishment. So there are references to King James I's demonology, as Hopkins justifies the psychological torture of individuals that were forced to walk till their feet were blistered and to be kept from sleep for 2 or 3 nights because then they would confess. His publication details methods on how to spot familiars and search the body of the accused for the devil's mark. So we've already mentioned that, but we haven't touched on familiars quite a lot. So it could have been anything. It could have been any sort of animal that was seen to be bound to the accused witch. So it could have been a dog, a cat, a rat, a ferret, anything. So you can see that in the picture. You have a lot of different ones. So he's there in his suit and you've got 2 witches that are in front. And one of them is saying, my imp's names are. So we've got lots of crazy names, but my favourite is the one that's at the bottom. So he's called Vinegar Tom. So they all have these crazy names. And that was a way of them saying that they were witches. If they had a familiar, if they had like a cat that was hanging around them, they actually would go in and just observe people for a really long period of time. And if you're thinking about like what your living situation would be like, and the chances are something is going to come in, something is going to run past, and they're going to say, right, that's your familiar, you must be a witch. So an important point to remember is that this is happening during the Civil War. So you do have all of those anxieties, you do have that Puritan belief in the devil that is widespread, and I think that is why it was able to happen. But you do have this questioning mentality as well. So you do have that idea of, well, are they really a witch? So they display a much more structured and regimented witch hunt as opposed to the trials in Lancashire. So the role of Janet Device in the earlier trials in Lancashire did not directly impact, it didn't directly influence those in East Anglia, but we do see elements of the Pendle witch trials that are present. So you do have the use of familiars, you do have the search for the devil's mark and gaining first-hand confessions. So Hopkins disappeared in 1647. So we're not 100% sure what happened to him. There are lots of different theories. Some people assume that he went to Salem in Massachusetts, where a lot of others moved and settled. But I think people tend to believe that he just died, that he died, and then you'd think that the witch trials would end there. And in terms of the scale, they definitely were not as bad. But in the next 2 years, you do have 19 executed witches in Chelmsford. So they didn't completely stop. They didn't completely die down. So you need to think then about how influential the trials were. So in this picture, it is an 1876 illustration. So this is of the Salem witches. So this is in the courtroom, which seems a little bit chaotic. And I've seen someone that mentioned a comment before about doing the crucible. So it might be quite interesting actually for you to hear this bit. So when you're thinking about the Lancashire witches in 1612 and the East Anglia hunt that began in 1645, you do see a shift from the importance of oral testimony to establish a case to psychological torture as a means of obtaining a confession. So if we turn our attention to the witch trials that took place further afield, such as Massachusetts in 1693-4, a correlation can be found between the Salem witches and the Pendle witches regarding the use of child testimonies and as witnesses. So the children that testified were between 4 and 17, so the youngest being Dorothy Good and the eldest being Elizabeth Hubbard. And across Europe, it wasn't, you don't see the same sort of trials. So you see a lot of elements that come in from across Europe. So the Malleus Maleficarum was published with the printing press. It was all hyped up, and that was very severe. It took a very severe view on women, took a very severe view on witches, and that didn't really get its foothold in England, but it definitely influenced King James's demonology. So you do have that connection, but you don't have all the torture that comes with it. So in England, we don't see extensive torture, whereas in Germany you do. There was a lot more to the witch trials, and you have like the Spanish Inquisition and all of those sort of torture devices that come into play that were then also used with witch confessions. So you also have a different focus sometimes. So it could have been in England, it was mainly women that were on the outskirts of society, that perhaps were widowed, that never married, that were brought up into a family of known healers or witches. Whereas in other places, it might be to do with their profession. So midwifery really takes a hit because babies would die and people would be asking, well, it must have been you must have used witchcraft to do that. And there is a case of it in York, I think it is, but which is slightly later. But yeah, so you do have that. More men were executed in different places, like in Iceland. So yeah, it depends where it is you're looking and for what reasons witchcraft accusations were used. When you see that men were accused of witchcraft, it can be linked to their political positions. So if somebody would gain their position perhaps by accusing them witchcraft, if they had something to gain from that, then that's when you can see accusations against men. And of course, there are a lot more trials that did take place. So I've talked to you about the Pendle ones, I've talked to you about East Anglia. You do also have those at Belvoir Castle and other ones that have been slightly overlooked. But I think it's a good thing to think, why are the Pendle witches so important? Why are the East Anglia witch hunts so important? Why do we remember them and perhaps not the others? So I actually did one of my projects, my undergrad dissertation actually, I did on the Pendle witches, and I actually visited, and I think that was the best thing that I could have done, because I was looking into the anniversary of it being like 400 years, and it's very, very good the way that they have kind of instilled the witch trials into their history. They definitely don't shy away from it. So you can do all sorts of different things. You can do this trail that explains the whole history, explains the whole trial. And it's such a good way of learning. And I think that is something that you can perhaps incorporate into the classroom. So when I was teaching history, I found it very, very helpful to have like a discovery-based approach and not necessarily tell them all the answers. I wanted them to find all the answers out for themselves. And I think that really, really helped. It helped with their understanding, it helped with their engagement. So I've also included a little slide because it can be quite challenging, I think, to find resources that are free, that you don't need a subscription for. When you're researching or teaching, if you don't have that attachment to a university. So I've included a lot of different ones. So Project Gutenberg is great. You can find all primary sources on there. You can find Thomas Potts's publication, you can find demonology, you can find lots of different ones. And there's the National Archives that has a great digital library, same with the British Library. And the UK Parliament one is very good for looking at all of your laws and your statutes and things that come into play and the shifts that happened surrounding witchcraft and the shift in monarch. So I will leave you with a last question, although I feel like you gained quite a lot from the beginning when I asked you about the how you would view a witch. What does witch mean to you? And I thought you were all going to tell me that it is someone that is a woman with a pointy hat and a cat. So I thought that perhaps by the time you got to the end, it might be a little bit different and you might have shifted it around a little bit. But yeah, thank you for listening, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hannah. Can you all hear me and see me? You should be able to see me now. Can you all hear me and see me okay? Hannah, maybe, and Ben, maybe if you just give me a thumbs up, so make sure I'm here. Brilliant. Thank you so much. I thought that was fantastic and incredibly interesting, especially for someone like me who, admittedly, I'm a bit of an early modern phobe. I like medieval history and then skip straight to the long 18th century, which is my big bag. So actually that was really, really interesting for me. If you will indulge me, two things, and there have been questions coming into the chat, which Ben will read out for us in a second. First thing, I think everyone will probably ask this or be thinking this. Hannah, could you send me your slides, if that's okay? And then what I'll do is, from the emails on Eventbrite, I'll send them round to everybody, so that, especially with those links, so that they've got them. Is that okay? Yeah,
of course. Yeah, I can email it afterwards.
Brilliant. Thank you. And then, as I said, if you'll indulge me, Mark, I recently actually watched, and I'm sure lots of people on here have too, the BBC comedy, the Witchfinder, which I thought kind of, and again, this might be a silly question as admittedly a bit of an early modern phobe, but it struck me that it caught or captured quite well the kind of bizarre nature of the accusations that are leveled at particularly women during the witch craze. So I guess my question coming out of that is, well, what's the most bizarre accusation or kind of bizarre piece of trumped up evidence that you've come across in your interest, or what made you laugh the most, I suppose, when you read it?
Oh, that's such a good question. It's such a hard one, because I kind of look for like all the juicy deep ones that have like lots more to it. I don't know. Can I have a little think? Can I have a
Yeah,
little
have a
think and
think.
get
I'll
back
tell you
to
what,
you?
let's go to the other questions and give you some
I'll
time
bear it
to
in
think
mind.
about
I'll
it.
come up
Maybe
with
we'll
an
come back to
answer.
it at the end. Ben, I think there's been loads of questions coming into the Q&A. So I'm going to hand over to Ben. For those of you who don't know, this is Ben Bassett. He's new to the Be Bold Network, which is really exciting. It has just joined our committee and just joined me at my school at Boulder Academy. And Ben's gonna read through the Q&A for us today. And Ben, what's the first question?
Yeah, so the first question is from Christy, and it says, in the situation of the Pendle witch trials, was the child testifying in her own words, or was she being questioned and simply answering yes or no? Could the interrogators be giving the children the language of witchcraft based off of the King's Book?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So we don't have like a direct manuscript. It's not a case of them saying like, oh, can you answer yes or no to this? There was a case where they lined up a lot of women, because with the meeting at Malkin Tower, they wanted to know who was there, and they tried to trick her out, and they put somebody there that wasn't actually there, and they said, was this person there? And she said no. So I think it was their kind of way of testing her to see if she was kind of just agreeing with everything that was going on, or whether she actually really wanted to say something. So I think in that case, that was a yes or no, but I think she was kind of coerced into what she was saying. I don't think she probably really understood what it was or what the extent meant. I don't think she really understood that it resulted in her whole family being executed. But you never know, it might have done.
Brilliant, thank you. And then another question was, with regards to the devil's marks, is there any record of any objections being made about how common the moles, freckles, and birthmarks are generally on most people? And what about the same on a man doing the investigation? Was it a similar situation?
Okay, so I haven't come across. Do you mean somebody refusing to be searched? Is that what you mean?
I think that's what the person is saying.
I haven't come across anything. I don't really think there was much trace in it, to be honest, because as much as you wouldn't want to be searched, I think it would also be important that you kind of prove that you wasn't a witch. But yeah, I don't know. I've not come across anything to do with that. But again, it would have been a lot of men that were involved in the trials, a lot of men that would have been involved in the searching. But I think that there were also women, so it can't just always be put on the men that would be stripping and searching, because there were women involved too. So you kind of have to think, well, what is the mentality of the women that are then doing that also?
Interesting. And yeah, I mean, actually, for questions, most of the other Q&As are actually just statements. So Sam, do you have any more questions? And if anyone else has any more questions, please do go in the Q&A section and ask away.
Yeah, I think that I can see one about the swimming test. Do we know when the swimming test was made illegal?
Yeah, I think that was just as he started. I think it might have been about 1644? It was in the 1640s.
And I'm assuming, is that the dipping one, or is that
like the ducking stool?
Yeah. Wow, Gareth, hopefully that answers your question.
We have another question through as well. So this person was interested to hear that you were saying that witch hunts were not a war on women. Is this the case in just the UK or throughout the rest of Europe as well?
Oh, I think that's a really big question, isn't it? I'm all one for looking at women in history. The projects that I've done are representations of women, representations of female criminals, and I think that's super important. But say, for example, with like Anne Barstow, you have feminist literature, and I think it tends to exclude the men. And I think although it was the majority women that were executed, and there's obviously something in that, I think it was a lot to do with the target on women, but it wasn't exclusive. There's a lot more to it than that. It can't just be a case of misogyny and that was it. It just can't be that, because it was so big. It has to have a lot of other elements to it, which is, I think, is why in different places in Europe it changes. So maybe religion might be super heightened. So if you were not Catholic, it wouldn't matter if you were a man or a woman. It depends how it's used, and I think it's manipulated a lot by different places. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it?
That was really interesting.
Yeah,
sorry,
and I suppose it's no, sorry, Ben, I've interrupted. And I suppose it's kind of, it's that constant battle we're facing in history, isn't it? Of there's nuance here, and there's not kind of a clear-cut story. Yeah, interesting. I don't know if you had any time to think about my naughty question, and apologies, but yeah, I'll pose it again just for the tape. Yeah. What's the most bizarre thing you've come across in your research?
I don't know if I have something that is super bizarre. I think the Pendle Witches is a really good one, because there's no real kind of reason. There's just multiple reasons of familiars, and I think that's the creepiest thing, like the way that they link familiars into the cases, and they really sexualize it, and I think that's a really weird thing for them to do. What other cases have I come across? There is a case that's not so much, it's not really like a funny kind of thing, it's more of a really weird kind of thing. There's a case in Germany of a midwife who I think was actually a cannibal, and she was accused of eating babies, but I'm not 100% sure if she is a cannibal. I looked at the case a really long time ago, but that's what it says. It talks more about her interactions with the children and how she would cook the children on the fire and all sorts of stuff like that. And I think that's a Germany one.
Yeah.
So it's really different to see how the cases are recorded in England in comparison to somewhere else, especially like Germany, because it's such a big difference.
Yeah, and this might be a leap, but the immediate thing that because Hansel and Gretel originates from Germany, doesn't it? I think. So yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, you wonder whether. Well, I wonder whether there is a link there.
Yeah.
Ben, I think there's been another question, or possibly even a couple of questions in the chat. Should we go back to that?
Yeah. So I mean, one's a statement saying "beautifully answered. Thank you very much." In response to your war on women answer. So that was great. And another question is, can you tell us more about the projects you've mentioned doing? Are there any books or any research publicly available online? And of course, as your Instagram blog and your blog as well, isn't there? But is there anything else available online?
Okay, so I haven't published my big studies, but I have created a blog. It's down at the moment because I'm doing a little bit of rebranding, but it will be up in the next like month or so, which is mainly to help with resources. So it's kind of a guide to the history, the resources, what it is that you can use. So that will definitely be up in the next month or two that you can have a little look at. But in terms of other books that you can maybe look at, I think there are key ones that you can read over. It depends if you're just focusing on England or whether you're focusing on a broader spectrum. If you're looking at the European witch hunts, in which case I'd look at like Brian Lovack, James Sharp. He's really great for England. There's one by Jonathan Lumby who focuses on the Lancashire witches, and Robert Poole. They're really good ones as well, and Malcolm Gaskill. They kind of give quite a broad. I've got one here actually, this one. Oh, you can't see because it's blurred. Can you see it? No.
You want to tell us what it is and we'll type it
It's just a little So it's a short introduction, and it is super short. It's like 100 pages. That's a great one. So if you're teaching and you don't really have a lot of time to kind of go and read like a big bookshelf of books like what I have, that's a great one to have a little look at, because it'll give you kind of an overview of all the different like types. It looks at like fear and anxieties, anger, all these different reasons that might have caused witchcraft accusations, sorry.
Is that just one of the Oxford short introductions?
Yeah.
Cool. I'm going to find a link and put it in the chat now.
Yeah, it's a really good one. Yeah, there are lots of a big bookshelf. If anyone would like any sort of recommendations or anything, I will put my email back up again, and you can just send me an email and I will just send over a little list of things for you to look at that might be quite helpful.
Brilliant, thank you. And another question through, do you have anything that you can say about the introduction of fairies into witchcraft accusations?
Of fairies into witchcraft accusations. Where is it that you're looking at for that? Does that come into Wales?
The person hasn't given any context on this, so I'm unsure what they're talking about, but I mean, if you know anything, that would be good to share.
I'm assuming it's Wales. It may not be, because it's not so much England. But with Wales, I think there are only 5. There were only 5 cases of witchcraft, which is slightly different because they had. I've not looked into it a great deal, but I know that their belief that already existed in a lot of mythical creatures, so a lot of belief in fairies and pixies and all sorts of things like that. So then when witchcraft came along, it's not a huge leap. So I think that might be the sort of connection that you're thinking of. If not, then be sure to expand on your comment.
We'll see if we get any extra Q&As through on that. Largely Scotland, the person has said. Largely in Scotland. Okay.
I'm not 100% sure on that one.
That makes sense with Wales, though. I lived in Wales for a long time. I have Welsh family and things, and that makes sense with the Mabinogion and things like the Welsh kind of is all based around mythology and folklore and things. So I think that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah. Ben, sorry I interrupted.
No worries. And did the sexualization of witchcraft coincide with changes in marriage laws and expectations for women? Can you say anything about that at all?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, isn't it? I think it's hard. I think you need to look at it separately, because I think the sexualization of women doesn't just necessarily coincide with the change in marriage laws. And I think you have to think about how they're also being represented, and who it is that's doing the representations. There's a lot of, I did this study that isn't to do with witchcraft, it's to do with women, and it was Harris's Covent Garden Ladies, and I don't know if anyone's looked at it, but it was this book that was created of like all prostitutes in London, and it was kind of like a go-to library. It was kind of like a Yellow Pages, which is crazy, and the way that they're all written about is obviously very, very bad. But I think you need to think about whether it is coming from men or whether it's women that are finding this liberation. So it may not necessarily coincide with the change in marriage laws.
It's very interesting. And I suppose kind of that's where the opportunities are, where I wonder whether, again, not knowing the spec that well at A-level, but I wonder whether there are opportunities there for people who are teaching this at A-level or GCSE to make broader connections, which would be very, very interesting. Ben, are there any more questions coming into the Q&A?
No, there is not. I'm just scrolling to see if we've missed anything, but it doesn't look like we have. No, there are no more there.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I think in which case then, this is probably the first time that we've ever been almost bang on 8 o'clock. In fact, it's definitely the first time for a few years at least. So Hannah, I think all that's left to say, and I know that there are already votes of thanks coming in the chat. So please do keep these coming in as we start to finish off. But I think that all that's really left to say is thank you so much for your time. I thought that was really interesting, and like I said, for me as I'm admitting now openly on air to everybody, as an early modern phobe, that was really interesting, and I learned a huge amount. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody for being here as well. There will be another webinar announcement coming out soon. We've got a couple of webinars coming up in October and November and December and beyond. So look out for those on Twitter, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for being here, and thanks again to Hannah.